Hello and welcome to the Lend Hoping Nothing podcast. I'm Michael Humphreys and I'm happy to be talking to you today. This is episode 15, and today I kind of want to talk about Bitcoin. And this is going to be one of those kind of amusing moments sort of things. So, one of the things that's kind of interests me about thinking through, financial realism, as I like to call it, is how do we think about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and so forth. And I had written up some kind of thought experiments about it a while ago. And so we'll talk about that and talk a little bit about what is Bitcoin and blockchain and things. One of the big things is that, several years ago, when blockchain was taking off because Bitcoin was taking off, I was talking with a lot of my other friends who are in the financial services, and we were talking about, investing in some sort of blockchain technology. And blockchain, as distinct from Bitcoin, is a particular software that might have useful applications. So back in the day, there was, different sorts of discussion about how it might be useful. So for example, in the insurance industry, you could have this distributed ledger, which would have things like death certificates and things. And so we would all have an agreed shared ledger, and so it would be this kind of democratization of data to relevant parties. And so the idea there would be that you could potentially eliminate or at least mitigate as much as possible insurance fraud, especially in life insurance. And this is a big deal because insurance fraud is an issue, and the face amounts on insurance policies is not negligible. So to be paying out benefits where they are not due does damage to the industry. And so being able to eliminate that fraud would be great. And so the idea would be, you'd have this sort of shared ledger where we all agree on the who has actually died and when and so forth. Another potential application that I had heard of, blockchain, was in job applications. So you have some sort of shared ledger that has your whole, employment history. It has, your certifications, your degrees and everything. And it's all verified and good. Because, that is another legitimate question, is like, well, how do you trust that, this application that you're presenting is valid. And so, one of the difficulties is, like, with your current position, if you're trying to find a new job while you're working, is, does HR go and ask, like, hey, is this what this person's been doing for the past, 5-10 years? So, so then you have this kind of distributed ledger that we all agree on your employment history, and then that allows us to make better employment decisions. So the blockchain technology has kind of potential uses, but back when it was starting to kick off, I was listening to webinars and reading about it, and over and over again, it seemed to be the solution that was looking for a problem. So it was just this big new thing, and so there was a lot of anxiety about missing out on this potential revolution, kind of like we're seeing with like ChatGPT and large language models now. Like, everyone needs one because we don't want to miss out on the AI revolution. So a little context there for the AI. But so, you know, as we've seen in the past few years, it doesn't seem to have taken off nearly as much as or as a lot of people had hoped. And so but the blockchain technology is distinct from Bitcoin. And using the blockchain technology as a ledger to deal with transactions is extremely onerous, because it's actually very, very slow, and also the ledger can get very large. So it's been a while since I've looked at these numbers, but like downloading the Bitcoin ledger, because you have to download the whole thing, like all of the blocks with all of the transactions, and it's quite a hefty object now. But actually using that in a real financial services tracking actual transaction would be extremely slow, because modern transactions take seconds, and I hadn't looked in the numbers recently, but it was like minutes to be able to do a Bitcoin transaction, for example. And so it's just not feasible at a large scale to be able to do something like that, especially like if you have millions of transactions a day. This distributed ledger gets onerous to be able to manage. So, but that's kind of some of the background on blockchain as distinct from Bitcoin. So kind of getting into Bitcoin, I've kind of talked about the idea of a shared ledger. And so the idea is that you have multiple parties who all have a copy of the same ledger, and then someone proposes a change to the ledger, which is a transaction between between two parties of some number of Bitcoins. And so people are going to come in and validate it to make sure it's a legitimate transaction. And this is where the whole cryptography thing comes in. And so to validate it, the whole mining process is actually solving this cryptographic problem, which is incredibly computer intensive, because what's involved with it is that you have some very large number and you're trying to factor it into primes. And so that is heavily computational, and that's one of the things that quantum computing, if it ever gets off the ground, would be really good at. And so if quantum computing is ever a thing, Bitcoin's pretty much destroyed. But you solve that problem, and if enough people agree that you solved it correctly, then there's this consensus, over 50%, that this is a valid transaction, and it's good to go. And then the transaction is then added to the shared ledger. One of the issues that came up was that if you have enough computational power, you could brute force your way into making transactions happen. So if you had enough power, and there's all sorts of people who will dispute this and things, but there was an occasion where some group did have enough power where they could just push it through, like they had over 50%, and they could just say transactions happened. And so it's kind of a might makes right sort of system. And they backed off because they believe in, I think it was they believed in the Bitcoin system, so they didn't take advantage of it. But that's at least potentially what could happen, and it could happen. And then I forget all the specifics, but when you do validate correctly a transaction, you potentially get a few Bitcoins, and then that adds it into the system. So you get Bitcoins into the system, and then you're transacting those Bitcoins. So the idea is that this is a shared ledger. And so we all agree on who has how many Bitcoins in their accounts. And then there's a consensus validation when there's a transaction between accounts. So the kind of thought experiment that I sort of developed was like, okay, so think of it this way. So there's a vault of property. So, it could be gold, it could be cash, it could be jewels, whatever. It's something valuable that's in a vault somewhere. And, the vault's closed and no one's paying attention to it right now. So in another place, you have a whole giant call center where people are taking in calls. And so people are saying, oh, me and George are going to transact. I'm selling him my share, or, my gold blocks or my jewels or whatever that's in the vault, and we're going to trade. So, they take in the call, they write it down in the ledger, they confer among themselves in the call center. Okay, this was a valid transaction, so then they all make a copy of that into their ledgers. And they're just constantly taking calls. And so they, someone else wants to make a transaction to move property from one account to another. And so someone takes the call, enters it into the ledger, they confer among themselves, they agree that this is a valid transaction, or they say that it's not a valid transaction and it's not put into the ledger and it's removed. And so this thing just goes and goes and goes and goes. So now, so we have now a ledger, a shared ledger that everyone agrees on. And then we have a way of making transactions. Someone puts in a call, you put it into the ledger, you validate it among everyone else. And then once it's validated, we all agree and move on to the next transaction. The issue, though, is, let's say that unbeknownst to anyone else, everything in the vault is destroyed. So prior to this, someone comes into the bank and says, oh, I want to actually withdraw my property from the vault. And they're like, okay, you withdraw your property, we mark that off of the ledger, and it's gone. So now someone comes in, takes it out. So now let's just assume that the vault is entirely destroyed, like everything in there. So there's like, a nuclear bomb detonates in it. Someone decided to put a nuclear bomb in there and just wipes out everything in the vault. But unbeknownst to anyone, they don't know. And they continue updating this ledger and taking calls. And, the numbers in the ledgers keep moving around. The accounts keep changing. Now move to the place where there is no vault, where it really is just ledgers with numbers moving around. And that's essentially what Bitcoin is. And the problem here is that, Bitcoin, the system is a ledger for accounting things, and the Bitcoin is the unit of account, but it's not accounting for anything. There's nothing outside the ledger. So like the thought experiment, there's nothing after all the property in the vault is destroyed. Your account actually entitles you to nothing because it's all gone. And that's the same case with Bitcoin, is that you're not actually entitled to anything. There's nothing outside the system that belongs to you. And so there's a sense in which it's just a, what is that called? A game of the greatest fool. So who's going to be left with the garbage when the whole game collapses? Because it doesn't entitle to you to anything. Like, you can't get out of it unless you can find someone to get into it. So that is essentially the problem with Bitcoin, is that it doesn't actually represent any real entitlements to any real property. It's really just a ledger that accounts for nothing. And so the Bitcoins really are worthless. Because like in the example of real ledger, the real ledger actually refers to property that has economic value. But it's not the units of account in the ledger that have the value. It's the property in the vault. And once that property is destroyed, there's nothing of value left. And so there's this type of economic anti-realism or irrealism involved with Bitcoin. Because it really is purely just, its value is purely because people are willing to believe it has value. Because it has no value outside of itself. Now, you could make the claim that, it's valuable because you could show it to, someone and be like, hey, look at the stupid thing I did solving this cryptographic problem, and I have all these Bitcoins to prove how much energy I wasted doing that. So maybe that would be impressive to someone, and maybe there's some value there. But as far as like real property goes, it has no value. And so it has really no economic value. And so some people have claimed that because like some companies and things are willing to accept Bitcoins in payment for different things, that it sort of takes on value. And at that point, you just have to point at those people who are willing to accept Bitcoins and just say, well, you're accepting something worthless for something valuable, so I'm not sure why that makes you smart. I think I vaguely remember that there was a country that was going to start accepting Bitcoins to pay taxes. Because part of this also has to do with the anti-realism around the way that we understand fiat currencies. And so people tend to think that fiat currencies are valuable just because we all agree to it. We all kind of are in this collective game where we all just say, okay, well, we're willing to accept that dollars are valuable, but it's only valuable because we all accept that it's valuable. But dollars are securities, so they actually entitle you something, and they entitle you to the remission of tax liabilities. So if you need to pay taxes, then you can give them to the state, and that will remit your tax liabilities. So that's a real entitlement that has real economic value. And so the fact that a tax authority is willing to accept something worthless for the remission of tax liabilities is more foolishness on their part than anything. So it doesn't actually, it still doesn't actually entitle you to anything. It's just you found someone stupider than you to accept your Bitcoins. So, and this time it happens to be a tax authority. So that is kind of the anti-realism or irrealism around Bitcoins. And for whatever reason, my air conditioner is starting up and it's freezing outside, so I'm starting to shiver. So, so that's kind of my thoughts around Bitcoins. And this extends somewhat to other cryptocurrencies as well. that I'm not as familiar with. I know some cryptocurrencies are set up potentially to have real entitlements. And I mean, even if you look at something like World of Warcraft was the example I thought about, was that your account in World of Warcraft actually entitles you to certain things. And so the gold you make in World of Warcraft entitles you to engage in the market and purchase things in the market as it's been set up by Blizzard and so forth. So there are real entitlements in World of Warcraft and their currency. That doesn't even exist in Bitcoin. So it's less real than play money. And you go to like you talk about Monopoly as well. Like when you're playing the game of Monopoly, the money you have entitles you to be able to purchase property in the game. Property, quote unquote. So there are entitlements within the game, but Bitcoin doesn't entitle you to anything. The only thing it entitles you to is, I guess, playing the game. Like you can transact with other parties for Bitcoins, and if you find someone dumber than you, you can potentially trade Bitcoins for real property. So so that's kind of my thoughts around Bitcoins and sort of the anti-realism. So I know that this isn't necessarily a popular opinion, and I know, for example, at New Polity, what's his name, Jacob has talked about the value of Bitcoin, especially in a market where we have fiat currencies. But I think it's it doesn't work. So if you have any thoughts or questions or disagreements, just leave it in the comments below and have a conversation. Well, thanks for listening, and have a good day. Bye.